Either one. You just have to go around and around. He has one too.
Morning, everybody. Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. You happen to have joined us if you flew in or got here by any other way except driving. You happen to join us on the one sunny day we've had in the last month. You've got a nice day. Anyway, today we have two reports that you've seen and that we'll be voting on today. It's a report from Working Group 1 on transition to NG 911 and a report from Working Group 3 on 5G risk management and security. There'll also be a readout, a status report from Working Group 2 on the reimagining alerting, emergency alerting, and that'll wrap it up for us today. So thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to our chair, Brian King.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Happy to bring the sunshine from Seattle. That's unusual time of year for us there, but no, it's good. It was pretty rainy when we arrived here last night. But yeah, as Jeff said, we've got two votes today from Working Group 1 and Working Group 3, and we'll have a readout as well on Working Group 2. So quite a lot to get through in what, the 45 minutes we're going to designate to this today?
Well, as much as it takes. This is like a baseball game.
Yeah, we'll go Friday afternoon in Washington, D.C., so here we are. But before we do that, I think I want to take roll call because we've got some votes today to make sure that we've got some folks on the phone. So if I could try this very carefully, if you could just announce yourselves on the phone, please, and we'll try and mark you as present for voting purposes and for quorum purposes. So I'll open it up, and good luck, everybody.
Don, pretty good. Don.
Okay, ahead, Dawn.
Charlotte Field Charter.
Charlotte.
Dan Henry and Nina.
Hi, Dan.
Kevin Gage, One Media.
Kevin.
Budge Courier with Cal OES.
Hi, Budge. Okay, and I'll note who's in the room, so I won't have to go around and everybody introduce themselves. But I think we have enough here from a quorum perspective. Suzanne.
Yeah, we do.
So with that, I'll ask Mary Boyd from West Communications to come up and give us a readout on what's going on with our transition to next generation 911.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, council members, and to those as well on the bridge. You might recall Working Group 1 is entirely focused on 911 and next generation 911 with a responsibility at looking at the reliability and the effectiveness as we transition to NG 911 and with a focus on making recommendations and best practices that mitigate against the threat of outages, both in a legacy environment as well as a NG 911 deployment. And I think we might, for those on the bridge and on the web, we may be having just a little bit of challenges with the PowerPoint. But, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, shall I wait or shall I move forward?
I'm sorry.
Just try the down arrow. See if that.
Sorry,
Oh, it's
just
Is that the right one?
PowerPoint's being on right.
Yeah.
Here we go. Thank
It's a
you so
technology forum
much.
here.
Okay, I'm printing. Okay. So I'd like to just take a few seconds and recognize the contributions and thank you for all the working group members with Work Group 1, as well as our subject matter experts that have been very, very dedicated to helping us in our deliverables. I'd also just like to recognize David Firth and John Healy with the Commission. John definitely is a subject matter expert in best practices and has been a tremendous resource to us. So thank you, John, for that. I might remind you, we have completed task our Task 1 report at the end of June. However, we decided to volunteer to take on some additional assignments. So the working Task Group 1 within our work group, we asked for approval to evaluate the existing best practices, looking for gaps as they relate to this transition requirement to Next Gen 911, and then where there also may be the need to develop new best practices as well as recommending standards. That team of people went to work very, very quickly. This slide is actually our update on where we are today. There are 1,016 best practices. John Healy gave us guidance on those, shared a spreadsheet so we could work from a commission's format. And so we have weekly meetings. Today we are at 808 of the 1,000 review. We have a weekly goal of going through 100. So you can see that I do have a really good team working on it. As part of that process, we've identified 31 topics where there's gaps based on the discussions of the existing ones that need to be addressed for the migration to NG 911. And so those will, we will begin working on those gaps after we complete the review. The other recommendation in our charter was to also look at recommending standards. That will happen after we complete all the best practices. You might remember as well, we got authority to work into the spring on the current charter of CSRIC. Our goal is really still to complete those, Mr. Chairman, by December. It's an aggressive goal, but that's what we're working towards. Our next task as part of our charter was really focused on small carriers and their transition and the considerations that they should have as they look at working in an NG 911 environment and supporting the 911 authorities as they work on those initiatives. We were asked to, oops, hold on, sorry, I'm right there we are. We were to give advice on what small carriers operating within a state or a region needs to do in order to be ready on time to deliver their traffic in an NG 911 compatible manner. The Commission asked us to look at economic disadvantages that might impede this progress. If there were any barriers to implementation that the Commission should address, and then they also ask us to develop a readiness checklist for small carriers that was similar to the work that was done during the TFOPA initiative in terms of readiness checklist for NG 911. So the Task 2 was responsible for this. That group was led by Dorothy Spears Dean and from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Jim Gerke from the great state of Texas, but I'm not a little partial there. And I'm going to turn that over, Mr. Chairman, to these individuals to do the readout on our report. Following that, we will seek support from the council for adoption of that. Jim, Dorothy, who's taking this one?
Dorothy,
Jim?
you want to say anything up front?
You on? There we go.
Go for it.
I just wanted to say that for those of us that work within the 911 community, we recognize that 911 is an ecosystem. It isn't just a matter of setting up the infrastructure in terms of the emergency services IP network. It's a matter of making sure that we're addressing all of the stakeholders and all of the participants that need to interact with this infrastructure. So as a state coordinator, this opportunity, and I look at it as an opportunity to contribute to this task within the work group for this CSRIC body, was very enlightening for me as a state coordinator to be able to learn the requirements and the needs of small carriers. And I hope we were able to make a contribution to the body of CSRIC work products, and this, I think, will be a very useful document moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Let's go back to the slide presentation. Okay. Before I get started, I wanted to extend some appreciation, I guess, to all of our work group. I think both Dorothy and I would
would do that. We had a number of all of our members, I think, joined those weekly calls and provided good input. A number of those members provided substantive contributions to the report, and I wanted to, kind of express appreciation specifically to people like Mike Pollock, Bob Sherry, Patrick Donovan, and Richard Muscat that did that. Also wanted to thank those of you and others that provided suggested edits to the report. I think all of those have made the report a better report. Susan, that included Addis along the way. Brian, certainly that included recommendations from your company as well, and we appreciate that. Also, due to the limited number of representatives from small carriers that we had on our work group, we did share a working draft of the company with a number, with several small carrier associations. Surely that included yours. Also included the Rural Wireless Association, the Competitive Carriers Association, American Cable Association. So in terms of the methodology side of the report, I wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that. The report structure is fairly straightforward. It essentially follows the template format that was provided to us by the Commission, including an executive summary, an introduction, an objective scope methodology section, background, analysis, findings, and recommendations, along with conclusions and definitions. By nature of the charge that we had, we focused on 4 types of small carriers, including wireless carriers, local exchange companies providing wired service, television cable operators, and internet data service providers. There's a large section of the report that focuses on the nature of originating service provider interconnection with next generation 911 systems, or with 911 systems in general. Part of the report lays out how that works in today's legacy environment for the sake of comparing that with what happens as we move into both transition and end-state next generation 911. In addition to that, we also looked at other factors, including call and data-related matters and regulatory policy issues of one sort or another. We were asked, as Mary indicated, to make an effort at generating a small carrier checklist. The example that we have was the similar checklist that was done for PSAP readiness under the TFOPA initiative. So we kind of started that with our guide. What's up on the screen now is just an excerpt from that section of the report. There are essentially 4 different tables in the report structured along this line based on each carrier type. We looked at essentially 3 stages of readiness, starting with a legacy environment, working our way through transition and in-state next generation 911, and then a variety of what we called essential elements of readiness. And then within the table, we identified essentially and provided a link to that section of the report that dealt with that. So in terms of features and recommendations, I'm not going to read every one that's here. If you've had a chance to look at the report, then I think you've had an opportunity to do that. I did want to touch on a number, though, that I think are probably the most important findings that we had. Certainly we feel like the small carrier transition timelines will vary by carrier depending on the resources that they have. We mentioned in more than one location in the report that it's important that small carriers work with their state, and I would say, and regional 911 authorities to coordinate their transition timelines and their expectations. And while the report focused primarily on originating service providers, we did make at least one recommendation that was focused on the public safety side of that partnership, and recommended the 911 authorities that they are encouraged to understand kind of the historical cost recovery models that we've had historically throughout the country and how that's impacted rural carriers, and that they work on staying flexible and how they address those issues. And then we also recommended, in a fairly specific recommendation to the Commission, that the Commission's encouraged to review and consider updating the historical King County 911 demarcation opinion or ruling, and do that in the context of today's world and, more importantly, the emerging next generation 911 world. Staff training, I think, small carrier staff training is important. We recommended that the Commission continue because I think, this CSRIC effort was certainly part of that, to assist in industry awareness of both the recommendations of this body, along with the nature of next generation 911 and how that impacts originating service providers. Again, we emphasize that carriers should establish contact with their 911 authorities, specifically as that relates to implementation schedules and functionality expectations. And finally, there is a major section of the report that deals with security and cybersecurity. We think it's important that that carriers understand that their capability in this area may be limited or reflect a combination of economic, technical, and operational matters. That this is truly a work in progress. The report attempts to kind of lay out the whole cybersecurity paradigm and what a small carrier will be confronted with. It doesn't necessarily suggest that they should immediately adopt everything that's reflected in there. We did receive, I would say, one substantive edit that I wanted to point out to you, and that was reflected in the revised version of the document that you received. That deals with Section 5163, which is the section that deals with roaming implications. And the edit, I think, attempts to clarify that there will be different ways that carriers will achieve heightened accuracy location information capability, that it is not necessarily limited to wireless access points, for example, and NEAD and dispatchable address. So the edit attempts to clarify that. And secondly, that in a roaming situation where you have a call that's roamed from a Tier 1 carrier, for example, to a Roam 2 carrier, that how they're achieving and their capability in terms of location accuracy may vary, and that it should be expected that one will carry across to the other. So, are there any questions?
So if we have questions in the room, the drill is just flip your tent card if you can, or on the phone, please shout out. Looks like no questions, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dorothy. Mr. Chairman, I have just a couple of other slides for updates. Do you want to accept the report before I wrap up with updates, or how would?
Let's finish your updates.
Okay,
and then we
all right.
can go.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so just in terms of where we are and next steps, as I indicated earlier, June and this meeting concludes our two large reports. We are still on track for best practices, and we are very hopeful that work will move quickly, and then we'll be able to conclude all of our work and deliverables for this charter. I once again just want to thank everyone. We will continue to give periodic updates. Commission staff stays engaged with us, Mr. Chairman, on a regular basis. So at this point, I'd ask the council to consider adoption of our Task 2 deliverable for Working Group 1.
Thanks. So, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jim, Dorothy, for all of the great work there. So at this point, yes, we'll open this up for a vote. So if you're in favor of approval of the report and its recommendations in the room, please say aye, and please raise your hand as well. Help me cope. So, okay, and on the phone, please.
Aye.
Aye.
No, I can't see you raising your hand, but I'll take that as approved. So thank you very much, Dorothy and Working Group 1. So our next agenda item is to bring up Working Group 3, but before Travis comes up, I really want to make an apology to the council here. Over the last days and hours, in consultation with Jeff, our DFO, and with Travis, we've been looking at some of the supply chain recommendations there. And so what we've come up with here is Travis is going to come up and talk about all of the great work that Working Group 3 has done. But we've really directed Travis and Working Group 3 to go back and look at really the supply chain area, in particular in the area of 5G and cybersecurity, to make sure that we're taking into account all of the recent congressional activity that's taking place with DHS and NIST, et cetera. So with that, I'll bring up Travis, but I just wanted to clarify that as we move forward. So,
Brian, before
Yep.
you do, let me just add a few words, and I'm grateful. Thank you for bringing that up and for making that suggestion. And just from my own personal experience here, I find this to be a topic where there's just a lot of change and churn right now, and that over the next few months, the working group may find itself in the presence of information that would help it arrive at recommendations that are more constructive than they would have at this point. So I personally, I think that this is the right thing to do, and we'll get a better product at the end as a result.
So yeah, with that, we'd expect you to come back in December with some additional.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
Travis?
good.
Yep.
So this report is mitigation of security risks to emerging 5G networks, which this has been a difficult report because 5G isn't here yet, despite what we hear on the telly, to use my UK terminology. It's coming, though, very quickly, but there's still a lot of things that have to be developed and a lot of things that have to be ironed out before we see true 5G. And so we did take that into consideration. Our focus for this report was on 4 areas of 5G rather than 5G just generally. Specifically, we looked at the Internet of Things in the context of 5G. We looked at network function virtualization and software-defined networks in the context of 5G. Open source software and the impacts that open source software brings in 5G, as well as the supply chain. So, and I have to learn to use this thing too, right? It gets ahead of you.
It does.
So great work by the working group members. Many of us on this working group are actually participating in the 5G standards, and so we had a lot of expertise on the working group that bring some firsthand knowledge as to what's going on and what's to come. So great job by the working group. They really did a superb job of putting this together. We also had some subject matter experts that we called on to bring us a couple of different perspectives. So Eric McMurray, who works with me in our office of CTO, Eric focuses on cloud implementations, which of course is very key within 5G. Roger Jover from Bloomberg, he brought in some of his research around security. And then of course Peter Schneider from Nokia brought in some viewpoints around network function virtualization and some considerations around the implementation of 5G using NFV. So we thank these SMEs for their participation as well. They did bring us some unique perspectives. So You'll see in the report, we broke this out into sections. I'm a writer, so I have to deal with chapters. It's just, it's ingrained in my mind. So the first chapter is what exactly is 5G, because it's not just the next generation of wireless as we have seen in the past. I was just in a meeting earlier where I was joking that I actually started with 0G, and every evolution has just been enhancements and improvements over the existing technologies. But 5G is different because we are totally changing the paradigm of how we build communications networks. And it's not just wireless, but it has also fixed communications portions to it as well. And so that's why 5G has really earned this nickname of the network of networks, because the access will be both fixed and mobile components. There's a lot of folks that are actually defining 5G depending upon which particular technology you're looking at. So 3GPP has the charter to define what is 5G, the architecture for 5G, what security requirements do we need in 5G. But there's a lot of other technologies that are engaged in 5G. And so, for example, network function virtualization, which is being defined by ETSI. We see technologies being brought in that are being defined by IEEE, by the Multi-Access Edge Computing Forum, and so on. And so there's other standards that come into play here. The last I looked at just the key technologies, there was about 15 different standards organizations that were defining those technologies that were being used within the 5G ecosystem. And then, of course, we have our organizational partners, of which ATIS participates in that for the United States. But you'll see there's a number of different countries that were involved in that as well. So this chart, I put this in there not to focus on what's called new radio in 5G, but more to discuss the timeline, because this was the only graph that we could find that really spoke to timeline. So what you'll see on here is that release 15 is done as far as the definition of release 15, and the work now has moved on to what is called release 16. And that's important to understand because when we look at 5G developments, release 15 really focuses on the radio portion and how do we bring 5G radio into our existing infrastructure. As we start looking at release 16, this is where we're going to start seeing more and more requirements around the core network. And so from a security perspective, one of the glaring things that we do not see in 5G today, there's no requirements for congestion control or for failover treatment. All of those things that traditionally we would see defined in a standard for the core are part of release 16. And so lots of work on that core network has just really begun on release 16. So you will see deployments, and in fact, this year, you will see some 5G deployments. There's 11 different models that were defined for how do I deploy 5G. The first one is what we're actually seeing now, which is, it's a really high-tech name for this, 3X, only because that was the third suggestion, I think, for implementation. But in 3X, it's actually using a 4G LTE network, but it's using 5G radio to augment that 4G aspect. And so it's 5G radio, but it's running on LTE networks. And that's, we felt was important because we need to make sure that our 4G networks are secure. So go back to the report that we wrote in March on the diameter security. It's important that those recommendations get implemented before we start moving down this path with 5G. And eventually we will get to this point where LTE, or what's called Advanced Pro here, will migrate out and we'll start to see 5G core network actually begin to get implemented. Engineers, by the way, when we look at standards, we're lazy. So instead of, putting the same names up there, we couldn't do that because then it would look like we weren't doing anything. And so instead, we just changed the acronyms. But the functions still exist you still have to have subscriber databases. You still have to have mobility management. And so this chart was actually in the report. And what it shows is, in reality, there's very, very few new functions that are being introduced into 5G. It's really more about how do we take these existing functions and maybe in some cases split them apart and deploy those using software rather than a lot of hardware. The other major change that we see here is in signaling. So, we've talked in the past about SO7, and we've had diameter. Another major risk that we see here is that we are now moving forward with 5G using internet protocols, which have been around for a long time. And so we said this many years ago when the industry started to embrace IP. Let's be careful here because we're inheriting all of the evils of the internet. Now we're basing our entire infrastructure in 5G around the internet and the internet protocols. And so that was another consideration here. This is all IT technologies that are being deployed in the cloud. So there are advantages to going to 5G, and so we listed out and provided a lot of detail around those. I think one of the big things that you're going to hear a lot, and we certainly have quite a bit of information in the report, is the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything, or the Internet of All Things. We'll see what the new acronym will be next week. In IoT, we introduced this concept of massive IoT. And I was just at a commerce meeting, and somebody was at the AT&T Summit this last week, I guess. And they actually heard from the Dallas Cowboys, and one of the implementations that they're looking at for 5G in the new Cowboy Stadium, which I didn't know there was going to be a new one because they just finished the old one. But apparently they're going to put an antenna under every single seat in the stadium so that everybody has connectivity right where you sit. That is what we call massive IoT, antennas every place. And so that is a major consideration. It's a big benefit in 5G, but it's also a big issue around security. And we did review 3GPP SA3, which is the working group around security. They did, in April, release a security architecture, affectionately known as TS 33501 for those geeks in the room. And in that document, it's the first release. I think we're going to see iterations of this, but they do start to explain and define security both at the network side as well as on the access side and on the application side. So that was another part of our work. And in fact, when you look in there, there's a few things that were actually defined for 5G. If you go back and look at our diameter report, there were some things that we focused on in the diameter report around location tracking, the interception of text messaging, the disclosure of personal information such as the IMSI. Those now have been addressed in 5G, and you actually see them in the new 5G document. So. And of course, we now have new subscriber identities, so you'll see where we also addressed this. And this is where we addressed this protection of personal information, because that IMSI, of course, becomes the personal identifier. Now we have something that is called the Subscription Permanent Identifier, or the SUPI. But to keep that even a secret, when somebody first connects, they actually send out their SUKI, and then you can have sushi for dinner. So you'll see that in I'll call this Chapter 1. This is the 5G 101. And then we dive into the section on IoT. And so as I mentioned, this massive IoT, we're going to see all types of things connecting into the 5G network. And so from a security perspective, it makes it a little bit hard to just go out and start addressing security in IoT. You really have to look at this by segments, by industry verticals, because each industry vertical is going to bring to it a different set of requirements. And certainly we recognize this in the work we've done with ADIS even, where we need to really characterize what is a particular IoT delivering? Is this a medical device? Is this an automatic or an auto-driving car or so on? And then that dictates what security mechanisms that you put into place. We also recognize there's quite a bit of work that's already been done around IoT, and so we did cite those. We certainly did not want to repeat the work that was done in CSRIC 4, 3, and 2, or in the ComSector Council white paper. So we did not go and reiterate all of those things. We do have some recommendations that point to those, but rather we were more focused on the interconnectivity that becomes enabled by 5G. So we'll talk a lot about use cases for IoT and how those have an impact, and you can really break it down into 3 different silos. You have human-to-human communications, human to machine, and then of course machine to machine. And so that was kind of our focus as we started defining some of these, is looking at it from that perspective. And lots of use cases, but I think the biggest one here is this concept of what's called low power IoT devices. And so these are the sensors and the actuators and the very small little devices that today it's very hard to deploy these, because in order for them to reach a signal to a 4G tower or 3G tower, it requires a lot of power, just as your phone does. And any time that you've got a lot of power, then the battery requirement becomes prohibitive. And so this is one of the drivers for 5G and this massive IoT, is to bring all of those radios in much closer, like in your chair. And that way, the devices don't have to have high power. They can have low power. And that's really what blows the market here. This is where we start to see everything becomes connected, whether we need it or not. I heard at CES in Las Vegas, they now have connected toothbrushes and connected combs, of which, thankfully, I don't think I ever need one of those. So we'll see this connectivity is actually leading to this proliferation of lots of things that become connected. And then consequently, those lots of things that get connected, since it's mostly very small manufacturers that introduce these, there is no security that's built into those. And so we looked at the various sectors that will be deploying massive IoT and took into consideration what would be the requirements of agriculture and how would that be different than transport, for example. And we also looked at some new technology that's been introduced to help manage those low-power IoT devices. Thankfully, 3GPP did address that. There is a function that has been defined for 4G that's also being carried over into 5G. So we did look at controls and mechanisms that could be deployed to help manage IoT. And then we went on to network function virtualization, software-defined networks. There's always a lot of confusion. What is network function virtualization? What is a software-defined network? When you think about the functions like the subscriber database or an HSS in 4G or HLR in 3G, right now I have to buy a engineered system, if you will, hardware that's dedicated for that function. The concept behind network function virtualization is to make that a software function, virtualize all of the functions within the network, and then more importantly, be able to I'll call it install, it's actually instantiate a new presence of one of those things automatically based upon analytics and some other things. So that's what NFV is all about, is virtualizing all of these functions within the network. SDN really has to do with the transport and how do I open up new connections, steer traffic across different connections, again, based upon analytics. And so we looked at these both separately because I think they bring in different considerations, whether it's an actual network function or if we're talking about connectivity. And of course, there are advantages, especially when we look at security, of using software-defined networks and NFV, because if I can automate a lot of this security functionality and then instantiate those functions, those security functions, at all of the layers within the network, that's a keen advantage. I don't have to deploy a new appliance to implement security in the network. And so they actually have some advantages. And then, of course, open source software. One of the things, by the way, open source is not new. Open source has been around for quite a while now. And I was actually a little surprised when I saw some of the statistics as to how much open source there really is out there. Open source is any software code that is published to the public and made available for free, and often there's no association as to an author, kind of like Bitcoin. Nobody knows who created it, but it's open source, it's available for everybody. There's no royalties, there's no fees for using open source. So for example, Linux is open source operating system. Everybody can use Linux and incorporate it into their products. And usually what will happen is you'll put a wrapper around that. So you'll have, for example, there's Red Hat Linux, there's Oracle Linux. There's ways to put a wrapper on that and to improve on that open source code. But one of the big advantages here with open source is that instead of having just your organization's eyes looking at that code, you have the entire community that's reviewing that code. And anytime you see vulnerabilities pop up, then that gets addressed by the entire community. And like I said, it is widely spread and used across all of the industry sectors. Just in telecommunications and wireless, this statistic actually is probably a little bit old. It's a couple years old. But 31% of telecommunications systems are based on open source software. Internet and mobile applications, 37%. And even cybersecurity, about 41% of cybersecurity systems are built on open source. So we didn't see open source as a threat. There's certainly some things that have to be considered when you're using open source, because obviously there are some risks with using the open source software. For the operators, one thing that I think concerns many operators is you're not going to know where open source gets used in a product per se, but your vendors absolutely must know what open source that they're using, because the vendors have the responsibility of making sure that if there's any vulnerability discovered by the community and reported through vulnerability reports, that they have a fix for that and that they address that in their own use. And by the way, just because there's a vulnerability for a particular piece of open source, that doesn't mean that the system that uses it is vulnerable, because again, vendors will put wrappers around that. So there might be a vulnerability for open source code if it's standalone, but when it's incorporated into an actual system, there's typically protections to ensure that that doesn't become a problem. And there are some tools which we addressed in the report that can be used by the enterprise, used by operators to manage that open source software, to manage the management of the patches of that for testing and so on. So that leads us into supply chain, which we did quite a bit of work on supply chain. As Brian said, we are going to take some more time to look at this in a little bit closer. You know, as we were trying to get all of these different sections done, it was difficult to spend some quality time here with supply chain. So I think it's a good thing that we'll have some extra time to do that. Everybody always says, well, what about critical infrastructure? Well, what is critical infrastructure? And so we used the ISA's definition of critical infrastructure as we started considering what the impacts might be. When you look at the complexity of a supply chain, it is a very, very complex problem, or I won't say problem, but it's a very, very complex machine that you have to take into consideration. And so, you know, for example, a smartphone could have 700 different suppliers providing the components of that particular device. And so you might have cameras coming from Korea, you know, and microphones coming from some other place, and wireless chips, and all of those different components coming together. And even though the device is US made, we have to get all of those components from all these different vendors. And so that's where we see a lot of complexity in supply chain. You certainly don't want to have something that's going to interrupt the ability to get something out there. So we also looked at a definition here around critical infrastructure in Title 42. I won't read that, it's in the report. So we did say, though, in the report that, 5G is in its early stages of its evolution, and as is the supply chain. And so there's still, I think, some more things that we need to look at and to take into consideration. And we did also look at the threat actors for 5G, and we'll continue looking at that as well as we take this into consideration for the extension of this. Risk management, by the way, is one of the things that comes to mind, and so we did spend quite a bit of time looking at risk management and how would we apply risk management in this context, and so we'll continue to expand on that as well. So that takes us to the most important part of the report. I mentioned I'm a writer. I always get paid by the pound. I think we did well here. We're at about 110 pages. I'm excited at the opportunity to add another 50 or 60 pages. So our recommendations, I actually broke this up because we had 4 different topics. And so I made the recommendations in 2 different sections, recommendations to the FCC by topic, and then recommendations to the industry by topic. The very first recommendation, when we looked at just general recommendations to CSRIC, is we think that there needs to be a continuation in this study around 5G, because again, we're still in the infancy of 5G, and I think more time is certainly deserved on this topic. We also have a recommendation to define how these risks, I got to remember that. We also have a recommendation to define how these threats and risks are going to get defined. I don't think there's a clear vehicle here on how the communications sector gets that intelligence information. We heard we touched on this too in the diameter report, to have a mechanism for that sharing. And then our recommendation number 3 is around participation with DHS, public-private partnerships, for the threat assessment. And so for IT technologies, we need to understand, we need to be able to assess, we need to define the mitigations together in a collaborative effort. When we look at regulatory actions for IoT, our recommendation is that there are no regulatory requirements from the FCC around IoT, that industry has done a tremendous job already of defining mitigation best practices around IoT, and so our recommendation is to follow those recommendations. Also a public-private partnership with DHS, with Commerce, and to coordinate with the industry as well as international partners. Industry, by the way, being both vendors and carriers. I think together, I think that's important. And then to deliver this roadmap of priorities for protecting internet as well as communication networks. For NFE-SDN, again, we feel that FCC should avoid any regulatory actions specific to NFE and SDN. The suppliers and operators, we've been actually doing a lot of development in this area already. There's been a lot of work and best practices around securing NFE and SDN, and that work continues on. For open source recommendations to the FCC, again, we recommend avoiding any kind of regulatory actions on open source. It's such a complex machine, as I said earlier, it would be very, very difficult to try to regulate any aspect of open source. And the industry is doing a pretty good job of addressing that today. And then we had recommendations to industry. One of those recommendations, I made a comment about this earlier. Don't wait for 5G. You need to protect 4G first. Let's get the best practices that were recommended back in March with this working group. Let's get those best practices implemented, because as we start rolling out 5G new radio on that 4G core, it's going to be very, very important that we have that framework defined and implemented across the network before we start replacing all of these functions with software. So that was our first recommendation. because in 5G it's using REST APIs, then there's two things that need to be considered. So recommendation number 2 is around the configuration of authorization of REST APIs. Special care needs to be taken when defining those and configuring those. The same for authentication. Special care needs to be taken when developing those APIs and configuring those APIs to make sure that authentication is correct and in place. Our next recommendation was around the protection of user data and the use of encryption to protect the user data and to provide protection and integrity to that user data between the device and the G node B, which used to be an E node B, which used to be part of the RAN. We just changed the letters. That's actually today, that's shown as an option in the 3GPP spec 33501. And so our recommendation was don't make this optional. It needs to be implemented. You need to put those protections for the user data into place. And the same true for RC and non-access stratum signaling. It's an option in the 3GPP security specifications, but we feel that it should not be optional, that protection should be implemented. Now, and then for IoT, our first recommendation was that network operators work together, collaboratively, for best practices and other ways to minimize IoT threats. We see a lot of this already today. A lot of work that's been done around the NIST framework, so we see that as very positive. Also, a recommendation, because I mentioned this massive IoT, and we have a lot of these low-power IoT devices, so we recommend that there's a mechanism put into place as defined by 3GPP to control those devices. And so I did mention, and it's actually called out in the report, there is a function that was defined by 3GPP specifically for the management and the control of those low-powered devices, also called narrowband IoT, by the way. Best practices, there is a best practice out of GSMA CLP.14, which covers API and SOA best practices. So we recommend that industry evaluates that particular best practices for application here. And we also recommend that industry follows the recommendations from CSRIC 4 and Working Group 5 for the mitigation of DOS attacks within IoT, as well as CSRIC 3, Working Group 7, the work that they did around botnet remediation. I think I went too fast. There we go. Botnet remediation and anti-botnet code of conduct. CSRIC 2, Working Group 8, where there was some ISP network protection practices, so we recommend industry follows those recommendations as well. And then, of course, the recommendations that were made by the communications sector coordinating council white paper. Now, for NFV-SDN, our recommendations to industry, monitor, and then analyze. So in the diameter report, we said monitor, and then monitor some more. But analytics really becomes key here because simply of the way that 5G works and the types of threats that we see, static monitoring is not enough anymore. And so analytics is a very key part to protecting the networks, and especially as we use software to define these. The next recommendation we made was to adopt any industry-driven standards, such as the ETSI white paper around NFV. There was a report on SDN usage in the NFV architectural framework. So there's some industry standards that have been created already, and we recommend that industry adopt those. And of course, we still have things going on around NFV SDN. NFV is also very premature, or maybe immature is a better word. So we recommend that there be a continued study here on NFV SDN by CSRIC. And for open source software, inventory management is absolutely critical. But I mentioned earlier that as an operator, you may not be able to identify all of the open source software that's in your network, because when you buy a system from a vendor, they're not going to disclose what open source components are in those systems for security reasons. But that vendor should absolutely have a system in place so that they can demonstrate, so that they know what components they're using, what's the state of those components, are there any vulnerabilities that are being identified by those components, and they need to be able to communicate that into the operator community. There should also be code management systems, and this applies both to the suppliers as well as to enterprise. If enterprise is using open source software within their own networks for applications or for whatever, then there needs to be a very comprehensive code management system that may incorporate things like digital signing to ensure that that code is secure, and testing of that open source code. And typically suppliers do this already, but before any open source software is incorporated into a product, there should be extensive testing across that open source code. And then last but not least, there needs to be a framework for managing the maintenance cycle of all of these open source components. And we did mention some tools that could be used to do that in the report as well. And so that is all of the recommendations that we have. Again, I think this was a great body of work by the working group. I applaud the team for putting this together. There's a lot of knowledge and expertise that went into this. So I encourage that CSRIC adopt this.
Thanks. So I think at this stage, first of all, thank you, Travis, and thank you for everybody who's contributed to the great work there from Working Group 3. I think you're competing now with Mary on the size of the report, so it's encouraging to see that. I did personally have one matter that I took umbrage to there. You know, as an engineer, I prefer not to be called lazy. Maybe efficient is probably something better to do. So at this point, unless we've got questions in the room or on the phone, we have a question from Tim Walden.
Just, and this is to Travis, probably you, Brian, and Jeff. Any more color or clarity that you guys can provide just around the comments that were made for the further evaluation of the supply chain segment?
Yeah, I think I could add, I mean, it's really a moving target, and since the report was written, there's been legislation passed through Congress, specifically around Department of Homeland Security and what's going on there in the area of ICT and evaluation of supply chain. So in just consultation here, we decided that we should evaluate what's going on there and make sure that we're involved in terms of looking at what those recommendations are going to be and what's going to come out of that, so that we can give a more thorough evaluation of supply chain and recommendations to both the industry and to the FCC.
So really what we're talking about is at the individual component level as well as assembly units.
It's going to look at, as Travis was saying, there's source components that come from all different locations, right, but also when things are put together in a holistic way, what everything looks like there. And there's a monitoring aspect to a lot of this as well.
Thanks.
Sorry, Dorothy.
Mr. Chairman, I have an observation, and I thought the presentation was excellent. It's another example of disruptive technology. But when we focus on what we're doing in terms of the future, we talk about networks, we talk about access to those networks, storage of data, and the facilitation of establishing those networks. But the one thing that we haven't had a discussion on is the consumption of data. And when you look at when the capability of this disruptive technology comes to the forefront, we're going to be inundated with data. And how are we going to consume that data? And how are we going to manage that data? So perhaps this is a subject that the FCC can look at maybe in future district bodies, because I know this is something that we're talking about within the 911 community now.
Yep. Thank you, Dorothy. That's a good suggestion, and it's timely. because very soon we'll be thinking about what we, assuming that we recharter CSRIC, which we've done 6 times now, it's time for us to be thinking about what we're going to be doing next. So we'll note that, and that'll be part of the discussions. Thanks.
Okay, further questions in the room or on the phone? Okay, so I'll just put this up for vote then, just to clarify, from the report, nothing was removed from the actual report around supply chain. The only thing was removed was sections 10.5 and 11.5, which are the recommendations around that. So again, in the same protocol in the room, if you're in agreement with recommending the report and the recommendations, please say aye, raise your hand. Aye. And on the phone, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, thank you very much. So with that, we'll bring up Farouk, who's going to give us an update on War 2. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I was enjoying listening to Travis
I know.
talking
All
about
day, right?
5G. Yeah. I just got here last night from Bellevue, where I was chairing a ATIS independent evaluation group, where we were evaluating all the 5G submissions to ITU from 3GPP, China, Korea, India, and so forth. So I was very interested in your talk. So, Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, I will give a brief overview of Working Group 2. And if you can go to the presentation, please. I know my picture is really good, but really presentation is better.
Susan, we got a technical issue here.
That's not my presentation.
Yeah. It's very colorful.
Yeah, it's very colorful. Yeah, this presentation is brought to you by Microsoft.
Intermission.
Oh, here we go. Oh, Jeff is going to get someone.
So how was Bellevue?
Just worked.
Sunny.
Bellevue, amazingly, I was told that it was one of those weeks, unicorn weeks, that was sunny and beautiful. And I come to Washington, it's sunny. I'm going to San Diego tonight. So I think it's me, wherever I go, it's sunny.
Okay. You can
All right,
take
so
credit.
why don't we go to Working Group 2? So I've listed the objective of Working Group 2, and it's very colorful, and it's an eye chart. I apologize for the eye chart. The colorful aspect is the red part, the red text is an additional task that Working Group 2 decided to take on in addition to what was originally given to us, and this was actually agreed by the council last time, and we are planning to provide that report December of this year. And we completed the first report, which was on reimagining of alerting, and now we are working on the yellow highlighted area, which is on the authentication and validation of the aspects of AES. So with that said, first let me point out to the Working Group 2 members, which as we all know, and we have said it many times, without their help, support, and contribution, there is no way we can progress the work, so we really appreciate it. There are a number of Working Group 2 alternative members who have been very helpful in providing input, so we would like to also acknowledge their input. Let's go to the work of it. So in the background, as we mentioned before, it's critical to have relevant information, emergency information in a timely fashion to the targeted individual, and importantly, in a secure manner. That aspect is the subject of our continued work right now. And it's really on the authentication aspect of EAS through some digital signature for the internet-based iPads using CAP. And so that's the basic focus of our group right now, making sure that the retransmission of any EAS participation do not generate any security holes. In addition to that, there was a recent FCC recommendation on Amendment Part 11 rules regarding emergency alert, that they have some specific requests and asks from CSRIC 6 that we have to focus on those. So we will answer those. So let me just go through some of the highlights of some of the points that we are really focusing on right now, some of the issues under consideration. The first one is on the CAP authentication. Looks like security is the theme of the day. I mean, obviously, it's very important to have the security aspect taken care of, and especially with respect to emergency alerts. So the first thing that we are looking at is this CAP authentication, and FCC has proposed that if digital signature is presented in CAP message, it must be validated. And also they said that CAP message must be disregarded if there is an invalid digital signature in it, which makes sense, and doesn't match the authorized source from FEMA or any other specified in the applicable state EAS plan. And that underline was subject to a lot of interesting discussion, which I'm not going to spoil it right now, but I'm sure we're going to have a lot of discussion on that in our final report. But some of the items that we're talking about is that should EAS units only process CAP EAS messages that are valid and digital signature? If you're getting one that doesn't have a valid signature, should you not even present it? So that's one of the questions that we are trying to evaluate. Another one is should CAP EAS digital signature rely only on the federal and chain, PKI chain? Interesting question to ask. By entering the digital signature requirement beyond FEMA iPods, by extending it beyond that, what impact does it have to EAS participation and EAS equipments? So, I mean, there are a lot of EAS equipments already out there. What are the impacts on those? And a simple thing like the FCC said, you must be discarded. What does discarded mean? Do you just drop it on the floor, or do you actually keep a track of it and then drop it, or what does that mean? So we are trying to have that discussion to make further clarification on the CAP authentication. Another aspect of interest is broadcast EAS authentication. FCC right now found it premature to adopt any rules on broadcast-based EAS. They're asking CSRIC 6, our group, to do further evaluation before any recommendations are made. And we have come up with some interesting questions. What authentication methods should be used, for example, that is flexible for broadcast EAS? Can a digital signature be added to in a way that EAS message does not get interrupted in the existing EAS protocol? So how do we add that so that the existing EAS protocols, they do not get impacted in a broadcast way? And then also, is there a dependency on the internet? We talk about broadcast often being one way. If there's no internet connection to do any authentication, what would happen to that? Is there a method we can provide that can happen, that authentication can happen without an internet connection? So these are some of the discussions that we have had. Also, the next one that we are talking about is with respect to alert validation and time stamping. FCC recently adopted a rule that it's basically said a window of 15 minutes is valid for the time stamping on the message. But they decided also not to talk about a year parameter and kind of declined to add the year parameter at this point. But one of the discussions that we had is it possible, and year parameter may be not used, but in the long term, if there's a replay attack or something like that, the year parameter can come handy. So one of the discussions that we have is that would it be possible to add a year parameter to obtain without really impacting the EAS protocol? So there are some interesting discussion going on. Yeah, maybe there are this way we can do add the year parameter and not have a major impact on the EAS protocol. But I mean, so some of the discussion we have is like, should we even take a step back and decide, well, maybe we should make some major, or maybe not major, but some additional modification to the EAS protocol. So we are putting everything on the table, and we say, hey, you know what? We understand that some of this thing has fully deployed, and there's reluctance. There are a lot of devices and so forth that to make any major changes. But aspirationally, are there any advantages to make any changes in the EAS protocol to the point that it really improves potentially the security aspect or on other aspects? So we are putting everything on the table, basically. In addition to this, as we discussed last time, the group was very excited to take additional volunteer work to do some more examining of some of the open issues on the EAS. So, basically we are formulating a roadmap towards enhancement to EAS, both in the broadcast and in the CAP, so that we understand if there are things we can do that improve EAS as a whole. And there are a number of people, and there's so many offline, online discussion going on the subject. I know that there are so many calls going on. At least there's one group that's calling twice a week just on this subject alone. So there's a lot of energy putting, and really, as I said, we appreciate all the work people are putting into this, and I think this is very important. So what's the status? We finished the first report, and we presented it last time. We are working on the second report on the security aspect of EAS. And we are meeting bi-weekly right now. That's one group, but there are twice weekly on some other groups. So there's a lot of activity going on, but the main core is meeting weekly. But as we're approaching the December deadline, I suspect that we're going to switch to weekly meetings again. We're going to have our next submission in December 2018. And we have two submissions. One is on the EAS alerting security aspect, as well as this ancillary report that complements our original report. And next step, obviously, is continue discussing the technical aspects, discussing security aspects of the EAS, continue bi-weekly, and provide status report as we are doing today. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will see if I can entertain any questions.
Do we have any questions in the room or on the phone? I have a question for you, Farouk. So the changes to EAS protocol that you're considering, how do you factor in kind of grandfathering in that regard?
Excellent question. And that is, well, I cannot answer you how we're going to do it, but what I can answer you is that is one of our major consideration. That we want to make sure that all these EAS devices that out there's some backward compatibility if possible, or if there are issues, we can highlight those. So we will definitely detail that discussion in our report, the impact of all these EAS changes on the legacy devices, or not legacy, but existing devices. But that's one of the items that definitely is a very worthwhile discussion. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Farouk.
Thank you.
Guess we've got a pretty big test of the alert system coming up with the FEMA test on next October 3rd. Yeah, so that's really good. So again, thanks to everyone from Work Group 2 and all of the other folks who presented today. Really appreciate all of the effort that's going into to these reports and recommendations. It's bringing us a long way. So I guess I'll bring us to close, Jeff, but I think you'll be pleased to hear, especially you guys on the phone, that the next meeting is not on a Friday, it's actually on a Thursday. So December 13th is the date. So again, not Friday the 13th, which is good for us. So with that, Jeff, I'll hand over to you for close.
Thanks, Ryan. And thank you all again for coming. Thanks for the working groups. I think for all of us here, thank you for all the work you're doing and all the work that's not visible today, but being done by all the members of the working groups, because we know this is just a huge force multiplier to get this done. So we appreciate it. Next meeting is, as we've said, December 13th. So please have a safe trip home today. And we're looking forward to seeing you here on the 13th. The city will be all dressed up for the holidays. So something to look forward to.
Thank you.